Welcome back to week 6. We are studying the quadratic formula this week. So remember, quadratic formula is just one of the ways that you can solve quadratic equations. Quadratic equations always take on the form ax squared plus bx plus c. And so you know you have a quadratic equation when you see that x squared term. That right there is the main clue that you have a quadratic equation. Okay, so a couple of things. We're going to use this equation right here, the quadratic formula. And those of you who are in my class, remember we actually sang this one. I won't sing for you today, but maybe you can remember the song. We're going to use these coefficients, A, B, and C, and we're going to plug them in wherever it has that letter in the equation. So we're going to say the opposite of the B term, plus or minus the square root of B squared minus 4 times A times C, and then we're going to divide all that by 2 times the A term. Now, before I figure out what A, B, and C are, it is important that, did you notice I have it set equal to 0? So let's look at this first problem right here. So the very first thing I want to do is make sure that everything is on one side, that all the terms, the A, the B, and the C term, are all to the left. So I'm going to subtract 20 from both sides so that that can happen. And so we have x squared minus 8x minus 20 equals 0. Now everything's on the left side. Okay, once that has occurred, now I can talk about what A, B, and C are. A is the coefficient in front of x squared. If there's nothing in front of x squared, what's understood to be there? Remember, there's an understood 1. That's like 1 times x squared. So A is 1. B is the coefficient in front of x, so that's going to be negative 8. And then C is your constant, the number by itself at the end, and so that's going to be negative 20. Always make sure to keep the negatives with the number that they are in front of. All right, so now we're ready for the plug-in. So we have x equals, all right, if we come back up here in my formula, it tells me to do the opposite of the B term. Well, B is negative 8, so the opposite of negative 8 is positive 8, plus or minus the square root of B squared. Okay, so we're going to have negative 8 squared minus, now that minus is always there, that 4 is always there, that's part of the formula, times A is 1, times C is negative 20. And the whole thing is going to be divided by 2 times A, which is 1. Okay, let me see if I can get rid of this part of that. Okay, so now if we start solving this out, we have 8 plus or minus. We're going to simplify what's under here first, under the square root first. So negative 8 squared, that's negative 8 times negative 8, which is positive 64. Then I'm going to multiply 4A and C all together. So I have a negative 4 times 1, that's negative 4, times negative 20, that's going to be positive 80. Negative 4 times 1 times negative 20. And it's all over 2 times 1, which is 2. Keep going this way. So we have 8 plus or minus. Let's finish simplifying under the square root. So 64 plus 80, that's going to be 144. And then all divided by 2. Now I'm going to pause real quickly. We're going to come back and talk about this number in just a few minutes. I want you just to think about that and remember that because we're going to come back to it. That number 144, that's the discriminant. What's underneath the square root? That b squared minus 4ac. And we'll come back and talk about what that tells us in just a few minutes. All right, so let's finish simplifying. So next thing we want to do is, do we know the square root of 144? Well, actually we do. If we take the square root of 144, it's 12. Well, since we know the square root, it no longer is underneath the square root sign because we took it out from under it. Now, when you get to this point, I want to solve this out. So x could either be equal to 8 plus 12 divided by 2, or x could be equal to 8 minus 12 divided by 2. So let's find both of these answers. If I do 8 plus 12, well, that's going to be 20. And 20 divided by 2 is 10. 8 minus 12, that's going to be negative 4. And negative 4 divided by 2 is negative 2. So my solution here is 10 and negative 2. Remember that plus or minus in front of the square root is how you get your two different answers. All right, let's try this again. let's go with the next equation. Okay, so here we have 2x squared minus 8 equals 0. Everything's on one side. It's set equal to 0. I'm ready to start figuring out what A, B, and C are. A is the coefficient in front of x squared. That's 2. B is a coefficient in front of x, but there's no x here. So if there's no x, we're going to say that B is 0. C is the constant term of negative 8. And just like last time, I'm going to use this equation right here, and I'm going to plug all of these numbers in for A, B, and C. So first part of this equation, the opposite of B. Well, the opposite of 0 is still 0. Plus or minus the square root of B squared, so that's going to be 0 squared, minus 4 times A is 2, times C is negative 8. And everything's being divided by 2 times A, which is also 2. Now we got to start simplifying under the square root. So we have 0 plus or minus the square root of 0 squared. 0 times 0 is 0. Negative 4 times 2 is negative 8. And negative 8 times negative 8 is plus 64. So negative 4 times 2 is negative 8 times negative 8 is positive 64. And it's all over 2 times 2, which is 4. Don't forget that part. Okay, so we have 0 plus or minus the square root of 0 plus 64 is 64 over 4. Okay, do we know the square root of 64? Well, yes, we do. 8 times 8 is 64. So the square root of 64 is 8. And just like last time, to find my two answers, I'm going to say 0 plus 8 divided by 4. And then I'm going to say 0 minus 8 divided by 4 to find my two answers. So 0 plus 8 is 8, and 8 divided by 4 is 2. 0 minus 8 is negative 8, and negative 8 divided by 4 is negative 2. And so those are my two solutions for this one. So if one of the terms is missing, if B or C is missing, just put a 0 in for that term, plug it in like normal, and solve it out. All right, let's try one more solving with a quadratic formula. So here we have negative x squared minus 12x minus 18 equals 0. Okay, again, we want to make sure everything's solved to 0. We want all our terms on one side, and they are. That's always the first thing you got to make sure. Always make sure everything's over to one side. If it's not, move it, and then you can do everything else. Then we're ready to label what A, B, and C are. Again, don't forget, A is the coefficient in front of x squared, B is in front of x, and C is a constant by itself. So A here is, well, that negative means that's a negative 1. B is negative 12, and C is negative 18. Okay, lots of negatives here, so we have to be very careful. So when we go to plug in, opposite of B, well, the opposite of negative 12 is positive 12, plus or minus the square root of B squared, so that's going to be negative 12 squared, minus 4, remember that minus 4 is part of the formula, times A, which is negative 1, times C, which is negative 18, and we're dividing the whole thing by 2 times A, which is negative 1. All right, again, we're going to simplify everything under the square root first. So negative 12 squared, well, negative 12 times negative 12 is 144. Negative 4 times negative 1 is positive 4. And positive 4 times 18, let me come over here and multiply that out. So we have 4 times 8 is 32. So it's going to be 72. All over 2 times negative 1 is negative 2. Up, I made a mistake. Do you see my mistake? What should this have been? This was a negative 18 times 4. So this should have been a negative 72, shouldn't it have? So it should be a minus, not a plus. Okay, because negative 4 times negative 1 is positive 4. But positive 4 times negative 18, that turns it back into a negative. All right, let's simplify it further. So we have 12 plus or minus the square root of... Okay, that's incorrect. Let's try this again. Something bigger than 9 that goes into 72 that's a perfect square. Do you know what it would be? Remember, we got to think about a perfect squares. So we have 2 squared is 4, 3 squared is 9, 4 squared is 16, 5 squared is 25, 6 squared is 36. Does 36 go into 72? It does, doesn't it? So we're going to do 36 times 2 over negative 2. So this is going to be 12 plus or minus. Now, square root of 36 is 6. Square root of 2, I don't know, so we're going to leave it like that. And now the only thing I could do is I could divide both of these whole numbers by negative 2 to make it little more reduced. But that's really all I can do. So one answer would be negative 6 plus 3 square root of 2, and the other would be negative 6 minus 3 square root of 2. Okay, let's talk about the discriminant. So the discriminant is just the b squared minus 4ac part of the quadratic equation. And what this tells us is if it's a positive number, that means it's going to, your graph is going to cross the x-axis in 2 places, which means you're going to have 2 distinctly different answers. If it's negative, that means that your graph never crosses the x-axis, so you actually don't have any real solutions, real roots. If it's equal to 0, that means you have exactly 1 solution. So if it's positive, you have 2 solutions. If it is negative, you have no solutions. And if it's equal to 0, then you're going to have exactly 1 solution. Okay, so let's practice finding the discriminant and then seeing what that tells us about our equation. So remember, the discriminant is just the b squared minus 4ac. That's all I have to calculate and then figure out what our roots are going to, or our answers are going to look like. So again, first thing, make sure everything's on one side. Now remember, f of x, it's the same thing as y. And we're plugging in 0 for y because we want to solve this out and figure out what's going on. So f of x should be the only thing on one side. If it's not, we want to move everything else away and make sure everything's on one side, and it is here. A is still the number in front of x squared, so that's going to be 2. B is still the number in front of x, so that's going to be 20. And C is the constant by itself. So b squared, that would be 20 squared because b is 20, minus 4 times a is 2. Times c is 50. Okay, 20 squared, that's 400. Negative 4 times 2, that's going to be negative 8. And negative 8 times 50, that's going to be minus 400. So we have our discriminant is 400 minus 400, which is 0. All right, what do we say about a discriminant of 0? Well, that means we have exactly 1 solution. That means that we have a graph that's going to cross and just touch in one place. Let's try another one. Okay, so we're just finding the discriminant. Again, the discriminant is just the b squared minus 4ac part. So a is the number in front of x squared, negative 3. B is the number in front of x, which is 4. And c is the constant by itself. So b squared, that'd be 4 squared, minus 4 times a is negative 3 times c is 17. All right, we might need a calculator here. So 4 squared, that's going to be 16. Negative 4 times negative 3, that's going to be positive 12. So you might need a calculator for this one because we have to say 12 times 17, which is going to be 204. And so if I add 16 and 204, we get 220. Well, that's a number greater than 0, which means we are going to have 2 solutions. All right, last one. Again, make sure everything's on one side. Make sure your A, B, and C term are all on the same side. If they're not, move them so they are. A is 1, B is 4, C is 10. Let's plug it in real quick. So we have B squared minus 4 times A is 1 times C is 10. 4 squared is 16. Negative 4 times 1 is negative 4 times 10 is negative 40. And if we subtract these, we're going to get a negative number. 16 minus 40 will be negative 24. And if we have a negative number as our discriminant, guess what? No real solution. Now, we're not going to say no solution because there actually are solutions. They're just not real numbers. Okay, you are ready to practice your quadratic formula and discriminants now. Remember, your worksheet is due by Friday. Let me know if you have any questions.